Hey, my name is Matt, and in this video I'm going to teach you how to recreate this title animation from the movie Lightyear, all inside of DaVinci Resolve. This isn't really a beginner tutorial. This is aimed at people who already have a basic understanding of how nodes work and the general navigation of the Fusion page. This is going to be sort of a long tutorial and there's a lot to cover, so I do have timestamps down below if you want to jump to something specific. And I'm also going to be using a couple of third-party tools. They're not completely necessary, but they are free. I'll show you some alternatives along the way if you don't have them. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into this. Okay, so I've got the original. I just downloaded this from the internet, and I'm gonna go ahead and go straight into the Fusion page. And I'm gonna go up here to Workspace and turn off the Page Navigator. I don't really need to see that. Let's go ahead and rename this to Reference. That way we can pull this up and put it in each viewer just to make sure that we're headed in the right direction. And I'm just gonna grab this and hold Shift to disconnect it and just gonna leave it over there hanging out. And then on the media out node, I'm just gonna right click and show tile picture. That way this is gonna be easier to find when the comp gets large. So let's go ahead and I'm gonna put the reference in viewer 1 and let's go ahead and build the space background. So connect a fast noise out to the media out node and go over here to color. And for color 1, I'm just gonna set the alpha all the way up and leave it black. And then for color 2, I'm just gonna sample some of that dark blue. Okay, and then back over on the noise tab, I'm just gonna increase this detail and maybe reduce the scale a little and move this around until we find a good spot. For the stars, that's real easy. We can just use a particle emitter and particle render node, and we'll connect those up, and then we'll just merge that right over the fast noise. And right now they're only being generated in this small circle. So if we go over to the particle emitter, go over here to region, I'm just gonna change the region to all. That way we have stars in the entire frame. Back over to controls, I'm gonna crank this number maybe like 500. And then under the style tab, I think it'd probably be a good idea to introduce a little bit of color variance. So I'll just add a little bit of blue. So some of the stars are blue, some of them are white. And then under the fade controls, I'm just gonna do something kind of like this so that they're not all equally the same brightness. That's looking good. If I go to the render node over here, I can also slightly increase that blur. That's too much. And also the glow a little bit, and then I'm gonna reduce the blur blend, and that's just gonna give it a little bit more natural looking. Okay, and then after the merge, I'm just gonna add a brightness contrast and take the gain down a little bit, and then I'm gonna use an ellipse mask and invert that and just kind of create a little vignette around where the text will eventually be. And then we'll just scale the soft edge up like that. So there's a quick before and after. Okay, so that's pretty much it. The only thing is I don't want the particles to start, blink and then slowly emit over time. I just want to find a good frame where there's a good amount of particles and I want it to stay like that. So I like this frame, number 63. So I'll just add a time speed node and change the speed to 0 and change the delay to 63. That way, this will always be on frame 63 throughout the entire timeline there. All right, so let's go ahead and select everything and then just hit Control G to group that, and then I'll rename this to space background. All right, and so if we ever need to tweak like the color or the stars or something, we can pop this open and make any changes that we need to. Okay. So let's go ahead and work on the text. You could do a lot of this in 2D, but these soft shadows are going to be very difficult to fake in 2D. So I think to get the best result, we're actually going to have to use the 3D text node right here. I'm just going to put that in this viewer over here, and then we'll add a render node after that. And then we'll just take the output of that and merge it on top of our space here. And so in our text 3D node, I'm just going to type in our title. Let me actually bring up the split view and put the reference in this view over here. And you can see how you can swipe between the two images. You can also grab this and change the angle. You can also hold Shift and it'll snap to every 45 degrees. I don't have the exact font that they're using here. The closest thing I could find was this one called Design System AW01. And I think it's gonna get us close enough. Right? It doesn't look exactly the same. It'll work. Let me go ahead. I think now would probably be a good time to add a camera. I'll just grab this camera and connect it and that'll create a merge 3D, and we'll go ahead and view that merge. Let me make some more room up here because this is going to get kind of complicated soon. All right, so with my camera selected, I'm just going to move this back. And I generally like doing a wider focal length for things like this. So I'm going to change this to 24 millimeters. And let's just scoot this somewhere like this. That looks like it's the right size and everything. These letters are a lot taller. So if I click on my text and go over to the shading tab, I can change the Y scale, and that's just going to squish them down so they look more like this font. Let me zoom in here. Let's move this up a little bit, and I think that is pretty close. I think their font is a little bit more slanty, so I can open this shear tab and then just crank the X down a little. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to keyframe the camera position, this zoom here. And so let's find in the original kind of where the camera stops. I think it pretty much maybe right around here. So I'm going to go to my camera and go to the transform options here and make a keyframe on this Z translation. And then we'll go to the very beginning and let's see. We need this to be pretty close, almost where the letters are kind of cut off. You know, something like this. We're also going to rotate these letters a little bit. You can see how they're kind of at an angle. Now we have this. And yeah, they're both moving kind of at the same speed and everything. We also need to rotate those letters. So I'm going to click on my text and go over here to the transform tab, and then under rotation, I'm just going to keyframe the Y. So I'm on the very beginning of the timeline, and I'm going to rotate these about 20 degrees, make a keyframe, and then they're pretty much done rotating around here. And then I'll just type in 0. And basically, I'm just going to grab both of these and open up the spline editor. And I want to look at the Z offset and the character Y angle. And I'm just going to grab these two handles and hit F. That way they're a little smoother like that. Cool. All right, the next thing I'm going to work on is the overall lighting of the scene. And so I think what I'll do is probably, you could technically do everything in one merge 3D node, but I'm going to separate this out just to keep it a little organized. So I will call this merge 3D lighting. And then let's go ahead and add a spotlight, throw it in there. And right now we don't see any lighting happening. We can toggle the shadows right here in this menu. And we can at least see them in our 3D viewer, but we still don't see them over here. That's because we have to go to the render node and turn on lights and shadows. All right, so basically with this spotlight, I'm just gonna put it, actually, let me turn on use target. And that's basically gonna give me this other control point where I can aim the spotlight, and no matter where this light is placed, it will always aim wherever the target is. So I'm just gonna leave it kind of in the middle of the title there. Basically, I'm trying to get like this soft shadow being cast from like the neighboring letters. All right, so let me add a transform node after my reference, and I'm going to put this in the B split view, and then I can move it down. That way we can kind of see both letters at the same time. With my spotlight, I'm just going to go back to controls and change the decay type to linear. It's just a little bit more realistic this way. And let's reduce this. And I'm going to increase the cone angle all the way to 90 degrees. And then maybe we'll increase the penumbra. So we'll just position this. And right now the shadows look absolutely horrible. So we need to adjust some of these settings. First thing I'm going to do is change this softness to constant. Let's reduce this. So to get rid of this blocky sort of pixelation that's happening on these shadows, I'm just going to take my shadow map size, which I kind of think about it like the resolution of the shadow, if that makes sense. So if I increase this, you can see some of that pixelation start to disappear. The density, this is kind of like the shadow strength. So we're just going to dial in these settings. Let's move it a little further back, maybe up a little higher. So that looks good. And I'm just going to rename this to right spotlight. So we're also going to copy this, paste a new one in here, and I'm going to call this one left spotlight. And with this one, we're pretty much going to just put it on the opposite side. So move this back this way. So with this one, I think probably mess around with the density, the shadow map size, and the softness until we get something that we like. Okay, so let me go to my text here and go back to the text tab. If I expand the extrusion tab, I can increase this depth a little bit. Let's zoom in here and make sure that this is roughly as thick as the original. Maybe I'll add some bevel depth and some bevel width. And I think just to be fancy, I'm gonna add another point light. And with this point light, I'm just gonna kind of move it right behind the lettering. You can't see it right now because our text is white. We're gonna change it in a minute, but you can sort of see without the point light, it just looks very dull. This kind of catches the light in a nice way. I'm gonna leave it like that for now. We might come back and tweak it. All right, so I've got my camera, my lights. Let's work on the material of the text. You can adjust your material under the shading tab like that. You could also use a replace material node and you can do all kinds of fancy things. The problem is without using a replace material node, you can actually independently adjust the front facing material and the bevel material. But as soon as you add in a replace material, this is just gonna replace everything, including the bevel. I guess you could technically do separate passes, but just to keep this simple, I'm just going to unselect use one material. The front facing material right here, I'm gonna change this from solid to image, and that's gonna give me this color input right here. And we could feed any two-dimensional image into that. So I'm just gonna grab a background and pipe it in like this. Let's rename this to text color. And we're just going to make this kind of a light blue. And I know that it's like too bright, but we'll fix that in a minute. I'm just gonna right click the text here and also show the tile picture. That way this one's also easier to find. And let's rename this to Lightyear title. If we look at the original here, you can kind of see how it's shining. And so easy way to fake that, I'm just gonna take another background. So we'll just call this shine. And let's just merge that right over our background here. Let me actually look at this. And with the shine, I'm just gonna make it a white color and then use a rectangle mask. Let's reduce the width and the height, change the angle a bit so that it's kind of like this. Oh, and in the text 3D node, you wanna make sure under the shading tab, you have your mapping level set to word and not character. Otherwise, it's gonna put this rectangle on every single character. We just want this to wipe across the entire word. Let's make it a lot softer, maybe thinner like this. And we're just gonna pretty much keyframe this position. So let's pull this up here and let's go to where it starts moving. So I think probably around here. I'm just gonna make a keyframe on my rectangle center controls. And then I'm gonna go forward. Okay, so it pretty much takes this long for that whole shine to go across. So I'm just gonna move this. And so now we have this nice little shine. And let me actually adjust the text color. All right, so I think our text looks decent for now. We can come back and tweak the lights, the material, things like that. Let's go ahead and get started on the beam that goes across and cuts through the letters. If you're familiar with 2D, normally you'd be able to just feed something like that into a mask input. Like, you know, you could take a rectangle and feed it into like a mask input like this. In 3D, it works a little bit different. You don't have a mask input, but what you can do is you can use a 3D object as a mat. You could do this with anything. You can do this with text, shape 3D, or a image plane. I'm actually gonna use an image plane because it will inherit the aspect ratio of whatever, you know, your project that you're working in. We're gonna create the beam and put it on this image plane, and that's what's gonna show inside the letters. So let me go ahead and merge this image plane after our text. And that created a separate merge 3D. I'm just gonna rename that to elements. That way it's a little easier to understand what's happening. Okay, so if you didn't know this, you can go over here to the matte drop-down menu and then select is matte. Right now it just disappeared, but if I push this right in front of our text, you can see how it's actually cutting everything that goes behind it, which is pretty cool. That's how we're gonna get the slicing through the text effect. So let me go over to the transform tab and unlock the X and Y and Z scale. And I'm just gonna eyeball this. And we're just gonna try to align this with the top letters. We have a problem. So it's currently cutting out the L. We could obviously, we could adjust this, the pivot to like right here on the edge and then move this forward. And we could just kind of keyframe this X, but later we're gonna actually create that beam in 3D space. If you look at the original here, the beam actually goes behind the letter L. So what we could do is use character level styling to push the L in front of everything else, just slightly, so that it's in front of this image plane so it doesn't get cut. But the weird thing, I don't know if this is just me, but if you try to do character level styling with 3D text, for some reason it doesn't work. So like it looks like the L is selected, but if I go to my modifiers tab, I can't like do anything with it. So I don't really know if that's like, maybe I'm doing something wrong, I don't know. So instead what we're gonna use is we're just gonna grab a text 2D and type in the same thing. And we're basically gonna use this to control the 3D text. So I'm gonna right click in my 2D text and go to character level styling and go to modifiers, shading. Oh, I need to select the L and see how these are all the attributes that you're supposed to get when you select a letter for character level styling. So if I go to position, I can actually change the Z offset just a little. And now whenever I go to my text 3D, I can right click in this field and connect to character level styling. And now you can see we've got our L adjusting. And now if I go to modifiers tab, I have control over just that L. So basically what I want to do is just move this right in front so it doesn't get cut by that mat. So if you're looking at it head on, it doesn't actually look like it's in front of the other letters, even though it's just slightly right in front so that everything can go behind it. And so at this point, I could actually just delete this text because the character level styling is baked into this 3D object now. I'm gonna rename this image plane to tail cut. And I'm just gonna pull up the reference and put it right below and just try to match the movement using the X translation. And I'm just gonna keyframe this kind of frame by frame, making sure that we're not ever stopping halfway through a letter like this, because I think that looks pretty bad. So now we've got our slice, and now we need to add the actual beam. So I'm just gonna copy this tail cut and then rename this one to tail, and then feed this one into the merge 3D node. And then I'm gonna disable the ismat option because I wanna actually see this one. And then we'll go over to the scale and just scale it way up so it fills the entire frame. And right now we're getting this weird artifact because it's on the exact same plane as the cut. So we need to move this just slightly in front of there, but we got to be careful because I don't want this to interfere with that letter. I'm going to feed this a background, and with this background, I'm just going to make this kind of like a blue color, and we're going to add a rectangle mask to that background and just make it really thin and wide. And let me just adjust this blue color a little bit. I think what I'll do is add another rectangle in between this one and our background. And I'm going to set the paint mode to subtract, and then I'm going to invert this. And then let's scale the height up really high and then feather this kind of a lot so that it kind of tapers off like that. So for the orb, I'm just going to copy this background and merge it right on top of the other background, and then add an ellipse mask to this one and make it really, really small. Something like that. All right, let me move this over a little bit. And basically we want to add like some realistic looking glow. You could use the built-in like soft glows. If you use like a bunch of them, they actually do look pretty good. It's a good idea to kind of create the first one very intense with a small radius, and then the next one with a slightly larger radius with less intensity. And you want to do that like several times. But what I'm going to do is actually use a free tool from Reactor called Exponential Glow. It basically does that for you all in one node. Okay, and I think what I'll do now is if you look at the original here, the tail kind of gets like blurry the further out it gets. So I'm gonna add a blur node, crank it up kind of a lot, and then grab a ellipse mask. Let's just push this way over here, something like that. And then we're just gonna feather this like a lot. I'm going to come back to my tail. I'm going to mess around with these, the X keyframes, the X position, just to get the timing exactly right. And we're going to add a lens flare later on, so it's okay. It doesn't really bother me that they don't look identical. It'll look a lot closer once we put the lens flare on there. Okay, so we've got the basic streak going through the letters and things are looking okay. I'm actually looking at this. I'm gonna adjust this background color. I'm gonna copy this blue that I had here and I'm gonna switch this to gradient. For this color right here, I'm just gonna make it completely transparent, and this color, I will paste in that same code here, and then let's just adjust this a little bit because I want it to kind of taper out. Okay, so I have the letters moving back. I have the tail from the rocket slicing through. The next thing I'm going to work on is the rocket. What I'm going to do is scale this up a lot. I just want to basically fill the frame because I want a really nice, crisp, high resolution. So I'm going to go ahead and just trace this. So let me grab a polygon tool. And the thing about the polygon tool, it's similar to the paint node. It's designed for rotoscoping, which is typically a frame by frame operation. So by default, you have this shape animation toggled on, which basically means if you draw a shape and then move ahead later in time and adjust the shape, it will create an animation in between those two. And I don't want to risk any possibility of accidentally, modifying the rocket. And so what I'm going to do is actually right click and remove the polyline animation, because I don't want there to be any chance that maybe if I come back and tweak it and I happen to be on a different frame, I don't want it to be like animated. Okay, so I'm just going to carefully draw around this rocket. Okay, so I can reset this transform, and basically what we want to do with this polygon is put it into our 3D scene here. This part's tricky. So this is just a 2D object, right? It's just a mask. I can put it on an image plane like this and connect it into our merge 3D. Just like how we did this, we set this to matte. This has the same controls, but the issue is it actually takes the information from the entire bounding box, not the actual shape of the polygon. And there's no setting in here that lets you extrude from the polygon shape. The same is also true for the regular shape node. Basically it's using this entire shape instead of the actual polygon. So this is where I'm going to actually use a third-party tool. This is from Krokodove. There's a link in the description where you can get it. I believe you can also get it on Reactor, but I got mine from his actual website, and it is free. So basically this is how it works. So you need to get a background node and connect the polygon straight into this. And this has to be white in order for this to work. Okay, so then with this background node, I'm going to add an S trace create node. And this node doesn't do anything, but basically what it's doing is it's finding the alpha or the luminance, whatever you have the map channel set to, and converting it into data that a 3D object could use. And so the next thing I'm going to grab is a shape create, which is also from Krokodove. So these two tools work together. And basically it looks like it's doing the same thing and it's making a 3D shape just like if you were to put this on an image plane. But the good news is if you actually click this and go over here to the KD tab and you select is matte, it'll actually use the polygon instead of the bounding box, but it's way too big. I generally find it to be better to feed it a really large image and then scale it down rather than, feeding it the exact right size or smaller. Because if you scale it up with the shape right here, then it's usually going to look pixelated and it looks pretty bad. So I'm just going to scale this down, move it right here. And then I'm going to go back to my polygon and I'm going to unselect solid and then increase the border width. One thing I've found that can be kind of helpful is you can grab this reference and merge it on top of your media out and then view that merge and then set the apply mode to difference. And let me turn off the split view here. And now you can kind of see where the pixels are the same and where they're different. Okay, so I'm just going to delete that merge and set this back how it was. So this is the rocket cut. And then if I copy all of this, I can paste another one up here and route it back in there. And then I'm going to rename this one just to regular rocket. And this is the one that's going to be visible. So I need to go over here to the KD tab and uncheck is matte. And they're intersecting. That's why we get this crazy looking artifacting. So we're going to just move this forward in Z space just a little, and then go back to this polygon, and I'm going to check solid again and then reduce the border width. Cool. And let's pull up the reference image again. We just want to cut out this little triangle in the middle. So I'll move this polygon back a little bit, and then I'll add another polygon, right click over here and remove the animation. And I'm just going to draw a little triangle cutout in the middle here. And then if I set the paint mode to subtract, we should get a little hole cut out. Great. So we have our rocket. Right now it's white. What I'm going to do is just borrow the same color that we used for our text material. And I'm just going to do something like reorganize this stuff a little bit. All right, so this is actually going to be fed into the shape 3D node, which will give it the same color that we have the text. And maybe I'll even add a brightness contrast just on the way over here to the rocket. And I think I'm just gonna bump it up a little bit. So we need it to animate on. So what I'm gonna do is go to the frame that I want the rocket to appear. I think the rocket should come on right there. So the way I'm gonna control basically like the on and off of the rocket is using these two backgrounds. These are sending the luminance value into the S-trace node. So if I make these solid black, the rocket will just disappear. So what I'm gonna do is create a keyframe right here on both of these backgrounds. And then I'm gonna move back one frame, and then I'm gonna change this to black on both of those. So now we get it popping in like this. All right, so we have the rocket, we have the streak going through the letters. We need to add a lens flare. There are a couple of lens flare presets built in. If you go over here to the effects library under templates and fusion, there's a whole collection of these lens flares right here. These are all using the hotspot node and different variations of it. But I think for this, I really like these lens flare tools from Reactor. The way this works is you need a controller. Here, I'm gonna make some more room out here. The way the lens flare tool works from Reactor is you need a background node. So we're just going to connect this into the yellow input here. And this is the control node. So this is basically the position of the core of the lens flare. And you can combine glows, rings, iris, reflections, all kinds of different elements. And basically every time you slot in a new element, like a glow, for example, you need to actually drag the control node over into the glow control slot. I'm not going to go really in depth on how the lens flare tool works. Emilio, the guy that created this tool, has a whole video on his channel. I will link that down below so you can check that out. But basically, I'm just going to try to build a lens flare that looks similar to the original. Okay, so to get this to move with our beam, it's obviously, you know, lens flares are in 2D. There's not really a way to put a lens flare in 3D space, especially if you want the secondary reaction to actually work with the coordinates of the camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to temporarily turn everything off that isn't the beam, the little Buzz Lightyear, basically this little background that we made earlier. I just want to track that through space. So I'm going to mute all of these. You can select these and hit Control P. And then I'm going to take the output of that background and just feed it directly into this shape. And that's going to it's going to disconnect the tail that we created earlier. And so after the render node, I'm going to add a tracker and feed the render node into this. And let's view that. And with the tracker node, I'm just going to drag it right over. I'm going to actually go to the last frame where it settles. I'm going to put the tracker right there. And then I kind of want this to have a large search area because it's going to move pretty quickly. So it needs plenty of room to find this little Buzz Lightyear. So let's track backwards. And if we track frame by frame, you can see the tracker actually did a pretty good job. And right here where it goes off the frame, I'm going to basically override the keyframes. So starting with this one, I'm just going to, let's just go ahead and move it way out here. All right. So now it's coming through and that's great. So what we can do with this data is actually connect the center controls to our tracking data. So I'm just going to select both the tracker and the controls and right click the center control and hit expression and then drag this little plus icon to the tracked center control right there. And now everywhere that tracker is where our lens flare will be as well. So let's make sure it looks decent. And there you go. That's a lens flare in 3D space. I'm just going to move this tracker over here out of the way. We don't really need this. I mean, we do need the node because that's where it's getting the data, but this output doesn't really need to go anywhere. So we can just kind of leave it hanging over there. So let's go turn everything back on. We need the rocket and the letters, and we need to reconnect the rest of the tail with our scene. I think another thing I'm going to add is some heat distortion with the rocket as it goes through the letters. You can use a displacement node with some fast noise plugged into it, and then you can use the lens flare as a luminance map so that it only shows up wherever the rocket is. You can combine several displacement nodes and feed in different kinds of blurs and fast noise into it and kind of get creative. I'm just going to use the heat distortion plugin from Emilio from Reactor. It pretty much does this. It has like a bunch of fast noise and blurs built in. I think DaVinci Resolve 18 has some sort of heat distortion, but I'm still running on 17, so I haven't experimented with that yet. So I only want the heat distortion effect to happen where the lens flare is. And so right now it's happening in the entire frame. So what I'm going to do is bring in a bitmap and then grab an output from this lens flare and feed it into the image input of the bitmap. And let's view the bitmap for a sec. And let's change the channel to luminance. So if we crank this down, we can kind of isolate it a little further. And then we can use this as a mask. So we'll feed this straight into the blue input of that heat distortion. So you can kind of see as it goes through these letters. Right now it's way too aggressive. I'm going to probably dial down the blur. Here's without it and here's with it. I think it just adds a nice effect. Because if we look at the original, they kind of have that happening too. It's sort of blurring the text behind, which is what we're trying to do here. Let me add a subtle little blur right behind the renderer, right after the render node. That's just going to take some of this edge off here. So if we increase that to something like 0.3, somewhere around there. And then I'm also going to add another little vignette here, take out some of the gain. Here, let's look at this behind the space here. And let's give it a ellipse mask. A pretty wide one, pretty soft. So I think we're ready to add some particles in the beginning. So let's grab some particles, and we need a render node, of course, and we're going to set this to 3D and actually add a renderer 3D, and we're going to take that and merge it right on top. And in the emitter, what I actually want to do is go over here to style and change this from point to bitmap, and that's going to let me use an image. And so I'm just going to create a little image here. Let's put this over there. We can make these white. And I'm just going to make a really skinny, long little beam. And then we're going to feed that into the image input of our particle emitter. And let's go ahead and view the particle emitter in a 3D environment here. And right now, it's just creating particles and they're stuck right here. But we need to actually go into the particle emitter and increase the velocity. Let's try 3. And they're going to the right. We want them to go towards the camera. So we can go to the velocity, and under the angle Z, we're just going to change this to 90 degrees. So that way they are flying towards the camera, but they're sideways. So we actually need to go over here and uncheck always face camera, and then we can rotate the Y. I'm gonna go back over to region and just crank up this size. So ours are definitely going way too fast. So I'm gonna go down to the velocity slider and just lower this to like this, I think. It looks like some of them are actually going a lot faster, so we can increase the velocity variance, and some of them will go faster than others. Okay, that looks good. So to get some variety in color, let's go over to style and expand the color controls. And I'm just going to add a little bit of blue variance. Let's actually overall adjust the color to a blue, something like that. All right, so that's looking good. And I need to kill the particles after a while. Let's probably try to kill them here. So I'm going to go to the particle emitter around frame 20. I'm going to set a keyframe on my number, and maybe we'll go forward about here, and then we're just going to drop that down. So no more particles should exist past this frame. And right now the particles start way back there. In the original, they're already up in our face. So what I'm going to do is just add a time speed node here. And let's maybe delay this by like 10 frames. That's actually looking like very similar. In fact, if I go to this merge node, I can flip it upside down. And we even have the same beam that's like right on the top. Okay, so I'm going to add a glow to all of this, and I'm going to do another exponential glow. I think this one I'm going to use the X glow just because I think this one looks better for particles. And let's maybe increase the source saturation a bit. And it's definitely way too bright. So I'm going to go into this merge node where all the particles are being overlaid on everything else. And I'm just going to change the apply mode to screen. And then let's reduce the gain. That's looking pretty good. Oh, one thing I'm going to do real quick is on my space background, I'm just going to add a little transform kind of like along with the camera. So we'll just set a keyframe on our scale here, and then we're going to go to where the camera's done moving, which is frame 101, and I will just go back down to 1, and then let's open up the spline editor and grab this last one and just hit F, and now we've got a smoother little zooming out space background. That way it kind of looks more like it's a part of the same 3D scene. Okay, well, I think we're pretty much done. I think to finish this off, I'm going to add a couple of effects. After the heat distortion right there, let me just reorganize things a little bit. So after everything, let's add some chromatic aberration. This isn't necessary, but it does make things look a little bit nicer if you add just a touch. And then we'll add some grain after this, and maybe we'll take this down to like a 3, and that'll just kind of roughen it up a little bit better, makes it look nice and real. Oh yeah. How could I forget? There's one last thing. We have to add in the Disney Pixar logo, which looks like this. And I'm just going to use the same color that we're using for the material of our text. I'm just going to copy that, paste it here, feed the logo into the mask input here. Let's just grab an image plane, connect it all up together, and put that right into the scene. Okay, cool. Not bad. Well, I think that looks good, and hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something and maybe you followed along. If you did, post it on Instagram and tag me. I'm at matthew.mccool. I'm just curious what other people are creating. So if you have any suggestions for future videos or whatever, leave them down in the comments. I'm always looking for new challenges.